We are recording this meeting today for our website, which will be posted later this week. But I want to thank you all for being here and welcome you to Northwest Neighbors Village's virtual speaker series. We're delighted to bring interesting programming to our community. My name is Stephanie Chong. I'm the Executive Director at Northwest Neighbors Village. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a local organization that enables older adults to thrive as they age in our community by offering a robust network of resources and opportunities. With the assistance of a small professional team, our dedicated core of screened and trained volunteers play an important role in reducing social isolation among our older neighbors, while also assisting with practical tasks. We're committed to keeping our members engaged and connected by providing a rich offering of social, cultural, and wellness programming, which brings us to today's program. Due to the size of our attendance, we're asking all participants to be muted. Our presenter will take questions from the group at the end of the program. Please use the chat feature if you have a question. And as mentioned earlier, our program is being recorded today. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today. Our speaker, Rachel Laser, is the first female and non-Christian president in the Americans United for Separation of Church and State's 74-year history. She became president and CEO in February 2018. Rachel is a lawyer, advocate, and strategist who has dedicated her career to making our country more inclusive. In her position at Americans United, Rachel oversees the organization's work to protect freedom of conscience for all and ensure religion is not used to justify discrimination. Prior to coming to AU, Rachel worked as an educator on white privilege and racism and held positions as Deputy Director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Director of the Culture Program at Third Way, and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. Rachel is a graduate of Harvard University and University of Chicago Law School. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. And I love what your group does. And I have long admired my dear friend Morgan, who I know does so much for your organization, who has told me about her work with you and bragged about it, really, her role in a modest way, but bragged about what the organization does, I should say. And I really appreciate it. So welcome, neighbors. And thanks for being with me today. And I should say maybe good morning on yet another day of 2020. So I wanted to start by asking everyone to just take a minute to think to themselves about what the first thing is to come to mind when you think about 2020. So just notice 2020, what's the first thing that you think about? So I'm going to hazard a guess that for most of you, it wasn't a positive thought. Possibly you thought about the election, especially given this moment, but I'm not going to talk about the election for a few reasons. We don't have a definitive result, and Americans United is a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit, bound by the Johnson Amendment not to oppose or endorse any candidates, just like houses of worship. I'm going to guess that a good number of you thought about COVID-19. Here, Americans United has had an important role to play. You may have read about the various lawsuits that houses of worship around the country have been bringing to ask for special religious exemptions to the public safety orders that many states have been issuing in light of the coronavirus. Our legal department has already filed 35 friend of the court briefs and counting, explaining that these religious exemptions in the name of religious freedom are actually unconstitutional. And that the religious freedom right that's memorialized in the First Amendment doesn't give houses of worship the right to risk lives. And I'm happy to report that in only 3 of the 35 cases where we filed our briefs have the courts granted a religious exemption. So that's a nice win. Some of you likely thought about the repeated and vivid demonstrations of America's continued racism problem that we've witnessed this year. Americans United for Separation of Church and State has a critical role to play here too And that's what I want to speak with you more about today. Church-state separation and racism are not simple concepts. And the relationship of one to the other can be hidden, but connected they are. So I'll begin today by citing some historical examples of government officials using religion to justify discrimination against Black and brown people. Then I'll show you present day examples, and I'll conclude by telling you how Americans United is fighting back and what you can do. So let's start with the past. In the Masterpiece Cake Shop Supreme Court case, do you remember that one about the Colorado bakery that refused to serve a gay couple, Charlie Craig and David Mullins, in the name of religious freedom? The NAACP submitted a friend of the court brief on the side of the couple. Their brief reminded the court that, and this is in the brief's own words, in the NAACP's words, that religion has been abused to rationalize blatant forms of racial subordination, and that many of these religious arguments date back to before the Civil War and featured prominently in court decisions and in the statements of government officials. I'll name just a few examples. Religion was used to justify the legality of slavery. In 1852, for example, the lower court, rejecting Dred Scott's claim for freedom from slavery, reasoned, and I quote the court, "We are almost persuaded that the introduction of slavery amongst us was, in the providence of God, a means of placing that unhappy race within the pale of civilized nations." Religion was used as a justification for anti-miscegenation laws too. In that landmark case, Loving versus Virginia, the trial court judge who ruled the wrong way when he was sentencing the interracial couple who got married reasoned that, quote, "Almighty God has created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix." And religion was used by government officials to try to stop desegregation and civil rights. So here's an example from the infamous Alabama Governor George Wallace, who in 1963 argued that the federal government's effort to enforce desegregation, quote, "is a system the very opposite of Christ." Or West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, who you remember was a member of the KKK, cited multiple Bible passages to oppose the 1964 Civil Rights Act, including, quote, "the Levitical rules against interbreeding cattle and sowing with mingled seed, arguing that God's statutes therefore recognize the natural order of the separateness of things." Another example of government-sponsored religious discrimination against Black people that actually spans from the past through to the present are private school vouchers. Whether these are disguised as a scholarship, a tuition tax credit, or an education savings account, vouchers in reality give government funds to primarily private religious schools, which violates the First Amendment's fundamental principle of church-state separation. But that's not the only thing that vouchers seek to hide. Vouchers largely originated as part of a Southern strategy to sneakily get the government to fund and maintain segregation when it was no longer legal to do so, while maintaining a facade of being race neutral. So the founding director of the Alabama Civil Liberties Union, a guy called Steve Suits, wrote a book about this that I recommend. It's called Overturning Brown, the Segregationist Legacy of the Modern School Choice Movement. And if I remember, I'll put it in the chat box when I'm done talking. And in his book, Suits explains how white churches started private segregation academies in the wake of court-ordered desegregation in order to evade these orders. And these segregation academies used religion as a basis for their segregation goals. So here's a quote from the head of the Louisiana segregated private schools in the early 1970s. He said, quote, "Our people, supporters of the independent schools, are convinced God is behind us. People believe wholeheartedly that God doesn't want us to mix." We learn in Suits's book that private school voucher funding of these Christian segregation academies were a key part of a larger Southern strategy to preserve segregation. So, for example, in October of 1954, which was barely 5 months after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the Boutwell Committee in Alabama, named after segregationist Albert Boutwell, became the first of such strategy groups to propose a full plan. And one of its 4 components was, and I'm quoting, "provide vouchers and other tax funds for private schools to operate on their own admission standards." Note how this is presented in a race-neutral way. 63% of Alabamans voted to approve the key elements of the Boutwell Plan, including private school vouchers, as an amendment to their state constitution. 6 other states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, also created strategy groups to block school desegregation, and all of them adopted vouchers for private, mostly religious schools. Which brings me to the present. Today, over half of the states have private school voucher programs that still predominantly fund private religious schools. And now, with the Supreme Court's Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue decision that they decided last term, the highest court in the land has declared that where states are giving money through vouchers to private schools, they're mandated to give money to private religious schools. This decision was a breathtaking blow to church-state separation. It also advances a hidden agenda of government-funded discrimination in the name, and this is the part that kills me, of preventing religious schools from being discriminated against. Rob Boston, who's Americans United's senior advisor and editor-in-chief of our great monthly magazine, interviewed Steve Suits for the magazine. One of the things he asked Suits, the author of this book, was whether voucher plans still prop up segregation. And I'm going to read you Suits's answer. "It's simple, really," he said. "Today, most white students attending private schools remain in virtually segregated schools, schools where students of color represent only a token portion of the student population, usually less than 10%. That is exactly the pattern that developed in the late 1960s and 1970s with the aid of school vouchers. As desegregation slowly moved across the South, private schools in the region accepted a token number of students of color in order to save their federal tax exemptions. Over time, the same school patterns have persisted, and now, with the financing of a new era of school vouchers, instead of only 6 or 7 Southern states using vouchers to support these private schools, we have 26 states today with voucher programs. Once only a Southern problem, now it's a national problem," close quote. But government funding of primarily religious schools through vouchers isn't the only modern day example of how the government is advancing a racist agenda by entangling itself in religion. And by the way, when I say in religion, I'm obviously describing only one very narrow version of one religion, really. In the past few years, we have witnessed plenty of other examples. Does anyone remember when then Attorney General Jeff Sessions quoted the Christian Bible to defend the Trump administration's racist policy of separating families at the southern border. Remember that? Can anyone imagine, by the way, our government similarly separating white children from their parents and holding them in cages of metal fencing? It turns out that the Bible verse that Jeff Sessions cited, which is Romans 13, is an old favorite of proponents of slavery. Professor of American history John Fea explained in a piece in the Washington Post that, quote, in the 1840s and 1850s, defenders of the South and of slavery invoked Romans 13 to ward off abolitionists who believed that slavery is wrong. It was hard to imagine a clearer modern day example of the abuse of church-state separation to justify racist government behavior until this summer, when President Trump tear-gassed a large number of peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters in front of the White House so that he could brandish a Bible in front of St. John's Church. The whole episode was an unmistakable dog whistle to his Christian nationalist base. Trump's Muslim ban is another example of this administration giving religious preference in a way that isn't only an assault on religious freedom, but also primarily harms non-whites. And really, what I hope this talk is making clear is how many other examples there are, and there must be, of government policies and actions that are motivated by white supremacist goals that are being intentionally hidden behind claims of religious freedom. So we've talked about some examples of our country's past and the present misuse of religion to advance racism. So now let's discuss what AU, when I say AU, everybody, I mean Americans United. I know that's particularly confusing for the American University neighborhood audience. So now let's talk about what our AU is doing to fight back and what you can do. So at Americans United, we do a lot of things. We litigate, we advocate, we provide expertise, we inspire, I hope, we inform, we lead coalitions, and we organize. We are the only nonprofit dedicated solely to church-state separation. And we have a well-deserved reputation for being the leading experts on both law and policy on this issue. The majority of our work these days is focused on ensuring that religious freedom acts as a shield to protect our right to believe what we choose as intended by our Constitution's First Amendment, rather than as a sword that causes others harm. Put another way, keeping religion and government separate is the only way not only to preserve religious freedom for all of us, and not just some of us, but also to ensure that the government isn't preventing end runs around our civil rights, laws, and disguising them as religious freedom. That's not religious freedom, that's religious privilege. So while we do work on both of the religion clauses of the First Amendment, the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, and of course, these two clauses work together to protect religious freedom for all of us, more of our work at Americans United focuses on the Establishment Clause and makes sure that the Establishment Clause remains robust so that everyone's religious freedom is protected and so that the government never forces anyone to pay the cost of someone else's religious beliefs. I like the way Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said it so often in her dissents. When it comes to the free exercise of religion, quote, your right to swing your arms ends just where the other man's nose begins. All of AU's work to keep religion and government separate is critical to ensuring that religion is not used to discriminate. And these days, that means It's not used to discriminate against LGBTQ people, against women, against religious minorities and non-theists. But some of our work directly challenges racist policies and actions. So for example, Americans United sued the Trump administration over the Muslim ban. And AU fights private school vouchers in the courts and in state legislatures. And of course, in Congress today, where we're dealing with Secretary Betsy DeVos's very aggressive federal voucher agenda. And I'd like to tell you about a brand new case of ours. So we've recently become co-counsel in a race discrimination case against a religious school in which the school is contending that it doesn't have to abide by one of our most fundamental civil rights laws, Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So here are the facts, and to protect the privacy of our client, who's really been through enough, as you'll hear soon, I'm going to describe what happened a little generically. So our client was a science teacher at a Christian school. And this school had an environment of pervasive and invidious racism. And I'm talking about things like it wasn't uncommon for students to call students of color the N-word or slave. And if that wasn't enough, the teacher himself was subject to some of the same personal vitriol because he has an African-American family member. So in response, the teacher organized an assembly and he brought in speakers to speak to the students about racism and about its effects in their school, especially on minority students. This sounds like it should be uncontroversial, right? Well, some of the parents did not like the implication that they were being complicit in racism. And so they demanded that the school fire this teacher. So first the school embarrassed the teacher by stripping him of all of the titles that he had, like the extra titles beyond the teacher of science. Then the school told him that it wasn't going to renew his contract in the upcoming year. Then the school went ahead and fired him in the middle of the school year anyway. So the teacher brought a lawsuit under Title VII, which we've just talked about, one of our most basic civil rights laws that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, including retaliation for claims of a hostile work environment around race. And in response to this lawsuit, the Christian school is contending that the science teacher was a minister, and thus they were free to fire him because the Supreme Court has said that anti-discrimination laws don't apply to a church's choice of its own ministers. To make matters worse, although no reasonable person would look at this teacher's duties and call him a minister, the school's saying that it has that the First Amendment demands that the court take its words for it, that this teacher is a minister. So according to the school, if they just say so, he is, and they can fire him scot-free. We disagree, of course, and what we believe is that this so-called ministerial exception should stay very narrow, right? And it should only apply to actual ministers or teachers and preachers of the faith. Religious schools around the country employ roughly 300,000 people, right? And all of their rights are currently in jeopardy, right? So these teachers should have the same protections that every other employee across the country has, but they don't. So the facts of this case are really, I hope you'll agree with me, pretty disgraceful. But one virtue that they have is that they expose what is often more hidden, which is the way that religious freedom is being misused to advance racism and really regressive social agendas. So here we are in 2020, still having to argue that the First Amendment doesn't allow and certainly doesn't demand sweeping religious exemptions from our civil rights laws, including around race. I've come to understand when we've had roundtables with some African American faith leaders, why they've told us, and not all of them, but some, that they can't even conceive of religious freedom that isn't about oppression. As you can see, AU has our hands full fighting for an America where the government doesn't use religion as a reason to discriminate or to license discrimination. And sadly, I don't think our AU is going out of business anytime soon. So where do you all come in? So you can help AU be stronger in being able to fight discrimination in the name of religion. And you can help us make more noise about the importance of church-state separation. So 5 years, so two and a half years ago, or now I think it's 2 years and 9 months ago, when I started at Americans United, we created a 5-year strategic roadmap. And that roadmap recognized that our legal and public policy work was already really strong, but in order to grow our power and to scale that work, we needed to raise the visibility of our issue and to ignite a national movement for the separation of religion and government that is in part led by a new generation of leaders, right? And that we needed to increase our revenue. And this work is underway. Over 800 people joined us virtually in September for our first ever National Advocacy Summit. And we launched also in September our first ever Youth Organizing Fellowship to train a new generation of leaders on our issue. And I'm super excited to tell you that by the end of this year or the very beginning of next, we're also going to be launching our first ever National Faith Advisory Council. But we need more supporters. Consider that our main opponents, which is a group called Alliance Defending Freedom, right? They're the group that brought the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that I referenced earlier. They're funded at $50 million a year. And our annual budget isn't even a fourth of that. So if you feel so inclined, when I'm done talking away, which will be soon, I'm going to put a link into the chat box, and I'd love it if you join us today. We have a fabulous monthly magazine, the one that I referenced that Rob Boston edits, really informative. And some of our members even take it with them and intentionally leave it behind in their doctor's office so that they can evangelize for us. And if you're already a member, you can support us by getting other family and friends to join us too. We also have social media accounts at Americans United that you should follow and retweet, repost, etc. We also need you to raise awareness about the urgency of our issue. We did our first ever public opinion poll at Americans United last year, and I was really curious actually to see the results and sort of stare at them in the face. One thing that was amazing about them is it was really uniform that Americans support church-state separation. 60%, a super majority of Americans across all demographics and divides said that the separation of religion and government is either the most or one of the most, one of the most or very important to them personally. That's great. However, only 1/5 of the country understand that church-state separation is under very serious threat today. So this is something else you can do. You can write letters to the editor. You can write op-eds, right? You can educate others about the importance of church-state separation. You can bring up how separating religion and government is crucial to many other types of groups you might belong to. Groups that support transgender and gay, lesbian, bisexual plus rights. Groups that support reproductive freedom. Groups that advance racial equity, as you've learned about today, right? How about any religious affinity groups that you belong to, right? Because this issue is a lot about defending the rights of religious minorities. Any secular groups you belong to. Who's the category of American least likely still to be elected president? Atheists, right? Maybe hard to believe in upper Northwest Washington, but when you talk to our members, you really get it. And finally, as I bet many of you have already started doing, you can do some of your own work on understanding racism and white privilege, right? Because understanding, if you're white, your own white privilege, your role in it, while it's really hard emotionally, is a critical part of creating change in whatever environments you are a part of. So I'll just finish with this one thought. Sometimes the task of dismantling racism and privilege, and the task these days of separating religion and government, can seem overwhelming. And when I lead groups to study white privilege and racism, I'm always sure to include in the group agreements that I set forth at first, expect unfinished business. So if you begin to despair, just remember these words of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, quote, "Real change, enduring change happens one step at a time." So again, thanks for giving me your attention and your ear, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was so informative and enlightening, and we're grateful for your presentation. There are a number of questions in the chat, and many of them are long and have multiple questions embedded. So bear with me while I go through this. But our first question is regarding yesterday's questioning at the Supreme Court in Fulton versus City of Philadelphia.
Yep.
Do you support the liberal justices' search for a compromise, or do you think that any compromise would likely open the floodgates on follow-on cases?
I don't think we can likely expect more than a compromise at best, but I reject the dichotomy that's being presented as a choice between religious freedom and LGBTQ equality. I actually think that religious freedom means that the government is never, through social services, imposing one religious viewpoint and privileging that narrow religious viewpoint in a way that causes harm to others, and that makes others of us bear the cost of their religion. That is not religious freedom. That's unbridled religious free exercise. That's religious privilege.
Thank you. And in follow-up to that question, what other cases are there queuing up to take advantage of a court finding in favor of Fulton and expand it?
What other cases are queuing up to take advantage of a court finding in favor of Fulton? I see. So on the bad side. Right now, our case would be one of them. So we have actually brought a case in the lower courts right now in South Carolina, in the federal district court, representing a woman in South Carolina who was turned away from fostering children at a government-funded foster clinic because she was the wrong religion. So here's what happened. So this is a lovely woman. She has 2 autistic boys that she's homeschooling and raising. She grew up with a dad who was a foster child. And so, like so many families and people who've been through hardship themselves, he actually took in many foster children when our client was growing up. She had so many foster siblings, right? And so she now is an adult, able to create, teach these same values to her children and help foster kids. She goes to her local foster clinic, signs up, does the long, application process. They tell her rightly that she would be the perfect fit. And then they say, this really happened. They say, we just have one more question. What's the name of your church? So she told them the name of her Catholic parish. And they said, we're sorry, we only work with evangelical Protestant families here, and turned her away. And it's a really sad case, but one of the beautiful aspects of it happens to be our client's name, Amy Madonna. So the lawsuit is called Madonna on our side versus US Health and Human Services, because when this happened, the governor, Henry McMaster of South Carolina, and the Trump administration doubled down and both issued policies that allowed religious exemptions to existing anti-discrimination laws. So this is like another example of, you know, whatever happens in this ruling, right, which could say some form of, you're allowed to, the government can create religious exemptions that allow discrimination against LGBTQ people. Well, here's a case. Can they create religious exemptions that allow discrimination against religious minorities and non-believers as well? So that's an example of a case that's in the courts. Justice Kagan, and I don't know how she'll come down, but yesterday in the oral argument, she point blank asked the Beckett Fund attorneys who were arguing on behalf of Catholic Social Services, are you saying that the government does not have a compelling interest in protecting LGBTQ people? And effectively, the lawyer for Catholic Social Services said yes.
I'm going to follow that with another question that another attendee was asking about, and that's about the issue of religious organizations contracting to fulfill what ought to be secular government functions such as foster care and adoption. How is that not an establishment clause problem? She goes on with a lot of other questions, but yeah. I'll keep it there and then I'll go to the next.
You all ask great questions. So it's not to the extent that if a religious entity is abiding by the same rules as others, then, you know, they often have separate entities even that perform, you know, social service functions. So, you know, if a church wants to, you know, have its parking lot operate as a place for coronavirus testing or something, you know, that's fine. If so long as coronavirus testing is open to everyone, right, who wants to get it, and the folks that are serving the public, right, we would say are being hired without discrimination as well. So it would be, you know, there are places where countries where they're really the predominant provision of social services are secular, where the government provides them. But today, and I just saw the statistic actually at some on a panel last night, for many government provided social services, roughly 70% of the providers are faith-based. So right now, we don't really have the infrastructure in place, and really the faith community is serving an enormous function, which again, if they're playing by the same rules, right, is fine. But as we can see, right, they're asking for special religious exemptions that are very dangerous to all of us, right? Think about it. If this can happen to this white Christian lady in South Carolina, as she says, right, it could happen to any of us. She closed an Associated Press article with, you know, that type of quote, like, today they're coming for me, tomorrow they'll come for you. I think that's really important.
Thank you. And this participant went on to say, it doesn't seem right that I always trip up on this word, evangelical Christian agency should be able to tell Jews and Catholics that they cannot be foster parents or adoptive parents. And that
100%.
The children who are in foster care also should have a right to freedom from this Christian evangelism.
Yes, and that point, yes, excellent point. And that actually came up in the oral argument. Neil Kotchell, who was the city of Philadelphia, our side's lawyer, explained also that there's actually a disproportionate number of LGBTQ kids who are in foster care, and that it's really limiting the pool for them if some of them would be well placed with an LGBTQ family. I'm not saying that that's always true, but obviously that assessment is made on an individual basis. But again, what we're talking about in this case is the screening process, the qualifying process, right? For the pool of parents who can be considered when it's time to move into the next phase of placement. I think something that's really important to understand, just going back to what we are talking about today, is how allowing discrimination in the name of religious freedom is it's a tool that's been, it's a playbook, right? That's been used, as we see, all across American history. And that, it may be even more clear to us sometimes, like, wow, like, they're turning away, like these days, wow, they're turning away a gay couple. But what people need to understand is that, discrimination anywhere is, an invitation to discriminate everywhere. And what, the Amy Madonna case makes clear is it's against LGBTQ people, it's against religious minorities. And I want to make clear too, how, Justice Barrett was trying to distinguish discrimination against Black people in yesterday's case. But I think it's really important to understand how the religious freedom excuse in this case gives folks the opportunity to discriminate against you based on your race as well, and to call it something else. So a Columbia University project studying religious freedom and racism put out a report a few years ago that showed that Catholic hospitals, even though they have these policies where they won't give out emergency contraception formally or allow sterilizations formally, that when you actually study the data, they make all these, all these secretive exceptions for white women, but not for women of color, right? So you see again how, oh no, like I'm sorry, our religion forbids us from being able to serve you, is being used not only to harm LGBTQ people, religious minorities, non-theists, but also Black and brown people in this country, right? We're all, it's really at heart. And I've just seen this so clearly through immersing myself in this issue about preserving traditional power structures. What are those? White, Christian, one narrow form of Christianity, white, Christian, cisgender, straight, power structures, really. And that's, in an ever-changing America, right? In an America where folks are feeling very threatened by the tremendous advances in the LGBTQ community, still not there and worried about going back, by the tremendous advances of having our first ever Black president, by the tremendous advances of a Me Too movement that took hold, or the unprecedented number of women who were elected to Congress in 2016, by the changing demographics in our country, right? Which I bet you're all aware of, the fact that 40% of millennials today identify as non-religious, by the fact that starting in 2014, we ceased to be a majority white Christian country, right? We're still majority Christian, like 65% at least, but white Christians actually stopped being a majority in America in 2014. These are all big deals and, causing a backlash, what Van Jones describes sometimes as a white lash, in all of these ways. And this is sort of some of what we're up against. So sometimes people say, like, gosh, it's all just so hopeless. And it just, well, it's not, because this is all in reaction to serious progress that we're also seeing. I know that's really hard to say in this moment, but it's true, and I really believe that in America, we don't have much more that glues us together other than our foundational ideals, right? And promises, ideals that we still obviously have not lived up to, but they're still the glue in this country. So I really believe that in the end, that we're going to prevail. It's just really, there are lots of very tough moments. And for this issue, we have got to be stronger. So I really do hope that you'll join us. In fact, while Stephanie is asking me the next question, I'm going to look for my link and put it in the chat box.
Thank you. Well, hopefully this will be a quick, easy question for you. Do you know if any religious institutions were eligible to receive financial support from the COVID-19 stimulus?
Many religious institutions were eligible to receive support from the stimulus package. And that was a real loss for church-state separation. It was also, it was like one of the hardest cases, right? Because we have so much sympathy for the fact that many Americans are still religious, right? I mean, in fact, we would argue, and Professor Fukuyama at Stanford argues, that the fact that our country has church-state separation is why Americans are more religious, right? In states where the government's forcing a religion down your throat, those states don't have as religious populations, actually. But we are sympathetic to the fact that church and other houses of worship closings in person is painful and hard from the standpoint of folks that need community right now. But by no means does that give houses of worship a special right over secular groups to have religious exemptions that risk people's lives in their own houses of worship and in their larger communities. And also, it doesn't mean that we should violate the core tenets of church-state separation by giving government loans, which, by the way, largely translate the way it's set up under the stimulus package into government grants that fund mostly or largely clergy salaries. That's what this coronavirus money was going towards. And religious schools, more money for religious schools. In fact, Americans United issued a report on the billions of dollars that are going to religious schools from the coronavirus relief. So I think that's a really important point. And, that's, I think it's a harder argument for us to win on right now on church-state separation when everybody feels so fearful and in crisis and worried about everything closing down. I think it's an easier argument for us to win these days and we are winning in the courts. And by the way, and in 2 Supreme Court quick decisions from last term, where Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, sided with the 4 liberal justices and didn't allow special religious exemptions for churches. That happened, and that was great. And some people have said, by the way, well, with Amy Coney Barrett on the court, is that really a change, though, since we already had a conservative majority? Well, it is a change. For example, in cases like religious exemptions for coronavirus openings, which were 5-4, right, with Chief Justice Roberts siding with us, right? And we will no longer have that majority. That's just one example.
Thank you. Another one of our attendees would like to know, are there any examples of people using religious belief to get an exemption for inclusive behavior? I think you've addressed this a few times, but you use the example as someone saying they have a religious obligation to admit refugees illegally or something like that.
So is this a question, sorry, because I'm not actually reading the questions, I'm just listening
Sure.
to you, about whether religious freedom is sometimes used by the left?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a flip, like, oh, well,
Yeah.
we have inclusive behavior because this is religious.
Excellent question. Again, another really complex case for us, right? Because there are those who say, well, let's just use their playbook on them. You know what I mean? And let's just, let's put food and water over the border in a southern state. And if they try to prosecute us, let's claim a religious exemption, right? And that's a very sympathetic argument for many people on the left, right? Like, yeah, go get them. But it's a very dangerous argument, right? And I think there's a reason why that I want to tell you, and I think there's another way to go that I would prefer. So the reason why it's so dangerous is because what we've seen is that more often than not, when a religious freedom right is claimed in a political context, right? Not to get an exemption for Native Americans to smoke peyote and and still get unemployment benefits if they test positive for drugs, or not so that a Jew can wear a kippah into the jury room, or not in cases like that. But when religious exemptions are being used and claimed in this context of a political issue, what we've seen is it's conservatives who win, right? It's conservative power structures that are reinforced more often than not. So what am I saying? I am not saying for brave and courageous religious leaders not to violate laws that they disagree with, but that's civil disobedience, right? And there's a place for civil disobedience, right? Just think about the letter from the Birmingham jail, right? I mean, think about the change that can be made that comes from civil disobedience. And that, and I think that's what sometimes is called for. I would definitely say nonviolent civil disobedience, to make that very clear, but claiming religious exemptions in those cases are dangerous. They set dangerous precedent.
Thank you. Another participant has a question about Catholic schools. How do Catholic schools consider women ministers for purposes of exercising freedom to fire at will, and yet don't allow women to be ordained? Have there been cases against Catholic organizations for discriminating against women who seek to become ministers?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to the cases question. That's just not an area of expertise for me. But I would imagine that would be a losing case, because the government, our courts, have found that when it comes to true matters of religious theology within a church, that churches get to decide, right? And so there we would have a really tough time, winning that type of a lawsuit. But I mean, the question, how could I think the point is that these exceptions for churches need to stay very limited, right? And the idea that the 300, that hundreds of thousands of teachers at religious schools could be fired because they have breast cancer, could be fired because they're old, could be fired because they get pregnant and they're single, could be fired because they transition, and they're transgender. The idea that this minister claim would allow these religious schools to do that is just wrong, right? That's not, that would allow kind of too many entities to be the law unto themselves in this country, right? Like, we in America have some strong shared values, and they're American values. They're no one's religious values, and religion infuses it for many people. Look, we all realize when we get to be a certain age that we're a part of a zeitgeist, right? Every idea that we think is original, or at least this happens to me, turns out to be, I named 2 of my 3 kids Emily and Alexander. Those are really common names today, it's like, we're not original, really. And so, of course, religious ideals come into play. Martin Luther King talked about his religious ideals in the public square, and no one chastised him for it. But he was able to translate those values into our shared American values, right? And that's what we're governed by in this country, right? So it's a very dangerous thing to grow these religious exemptions. And as I hope you can see from my talk earlier, that they are so often being grown to allow traditional power structures to stay in place, right? And not, and sort of, and disguising that, right? Disguising that in this moral garb of religion, right? That feels for so many people untouchable. But some pieces of religion are untouchable, right? I don't want anyone telling my synagogue, I don't want them telling them who to hire as our rabbi, that they can't discriminate based on religion. You know what I mean? Or that, and I don't like that women can't be ordained, but you know, if I'm Catholic and if I don't like it, you know, if I'm an Orthodox Jew and I don't like it, if I'm, you know, I can change. And by the way, being able to change your religious identity, being able to leave your religion, being able to concoct your own spiritual brew, even if it's you know, not God-based, or that's all part of the beauty of what's protected, what's supposed to be protected in America, right? And to be secure in the fact that no matter what you believe or what you change your belief system to, that our government is going to treat you exactly equally, right? That's the beauty of the First Amendment and the American promise. And honestly, that's what's very under threat today. You know, that's why we really need to be stronger than we are. This issue is too nichey, you know, and I just really, if I have two hopes, it's that you'll join us today, you'll get our magazine every month, you'll get our emails to plug you into taking action, and that you'll maybe in this next week, remember to tell one friend or family member about us and about our issue. That would be great.
Thank you. Rachel, there are two other questions, and I know we're almost at the 12 o'clock hour. Would you indulge us in those two questions? Because they're really good.
Of course.
Okay.
I'll try to be faster too in answering them.
Well, this is a really loaded question. It probably could have been a program in and of itself. So we'll see how you answer this. But what is the best hope for the future, both with the lower courts and Supreme Court?
That is a hard question. I think what I'll say is two things. The best hope for the future on the one hand is, but it's a dangerous line to walk, is that we could get some decisions that are like rallying cries that lead to change, but that aren't memorializing constitutional principles, right? Where the court is the primary arbiter and it's harder to change, right? We would only change a bad Supreme Court decision on the Constitution by passing a constitutional amendment or having the Supreme Court reverse that decision. So it's dangerous, but if the Supreme Court issues an outrageous decision that isn't memorializing anything in the Constitution, sometimes that leads to dramatic change. And an example that I'd like to point to is the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. That was one of the cases, the first cases actually, may have even been the first, where Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg decided to become more of a drama queen in a good way. And she read her dissent from the bench in that case, and she called on Congress to pass a Fair Pay Act to remedy what the court had done. And Congress did, you know, and Congress passed that. So that's one hope. And then the other hope is that we fix the problem by forming what, do you all know Reverend Barber in North Carolina? He's so great. Black pastor who's an inspirer and organizer of the Poor People's Campaign. And what he talks about is the need to form a moral fusion movement today, where we're all banding together. We're getting out of our silos. Those of us who care about creating a more inclusive America are coming together to create the America that we want. And I believe we're getting there, even if, well, I can't say what I wanted to just say, but I believe that we're getting there. And I think that will ultimately change the composition of the courts, but it might take some time.
Thank you. And then our last question, I think you've alluded to this a few times already, but it would be nice to sort of put an exclamation point at the end of your program.
Yep.
Do you have any materials that include your talking points and the supporting examples you've used, or any materials that would help us draft letters to the editor?
Absolutely. So 100%. So at Americans United, we have an amazing outreach and engagement team. They're wonderful. And I will drop in the box my email and a couple things. I mean, one is that's my email, but anyone who wants to do such a wonderful thing, in my religion, we would call it a mitzvah. But anyone who wants to do such a wonderful thing, you can email me. And also, if you do join us at that link that I put in the box, you will get emails that will give you toolkits to be able to write such letters, and where you can meet our outreach and engagement team, and they will hold your hand in being able to do that. So that is a delightful question, and I can't wait to see the product of what you create.
I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for exposing some of these disguised discriminative practices that just happen. And we need people like you to help make us aware so that we can make this country a better country, and just appreciate your dedication to this. I have unmuted everybody because I always like to let everybody give the opportunity to say thank you, wave, clap your hands, whatever, but we really appreciate you and wish everybody well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Nice job.
Bye-bye.
Good job, Rachel.